All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Greetings and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Chelsea Mary Elise Johnson, a sociologist and user experience researcher specializing in trust and inclusive design and technology. She's the co-author of two critically acclaimed sociology books for children, Intersection Allies, We Make Room for All, and Love Without Bounds, an Intersection Allies book about families. She joins us today to talk about her most recent book, Natural, Black Beauty and the Politics of Hair, published by our friends at New York University Press. Of Natural, our friend Tanisha C. Ford writes, Natural takes readers on a journey across 4 continents to examine Black women's hair care. Chelsea Mary Elise Johnson offers fresh insights on topics such as Black femininity, texturism, and the technologies of resistance. This book is a blueprint for studying the natural hair movement in the age of social media. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to be here and honored to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine and looking forward to talking with you about this wonderful book. Let's start with your road to this book. What was your inspiration for it?
So I started thinking about race, class, gender, and bodies as an undergrad at Spelman. So shout out to Spelman, my alma mater. And just as I was beginning my journey into sociology as an undergrad student, where I was thinking about bodies and embodiment, Black femininity, Black feminist praxis. This was 2008, 2009, 2010. So it was also a moment where something was blossoming in popular culture on the internet. And that was Black women transitioning to their natural hair texture, reimagining what beauty looked like. So this is the beginning of Twitter. This is the beginning of Tumblr, of Facebook, of Instagram. And so just me as like an undergrad student for the first time outside of my own environment growing up, I was going through that embodied journey myself, and like being introduced to the tools of feminism, being introduced to the tools of sociology, taking sort of like a critical, self-reflective lens to what me and a lot of my classmates were experiencing. So when I went on to grad school, that's what I ended up following and focusing on for my work over the next decade.
So were you raised up north or were you raised in the South?
I'm a Midwestern girl.
Okay.
Suburbs of Chicago.
Because my own memories of my daughters, who are now both adults, that the idea of natural hair in the South seemed to be a real disconnect. There were still people very much invested in the press and curls look for Black girls. But as you articulate, right, that there's this shift that happens, that also simultaneously is occurring with the expansion of social media. So natural hair becomes a different kind of conversation in that moment. And I was struck by one of the observations that you make, that there were a generation of girls who had grown up having their hair processed, who actually didn't know what the texture of their natural hair was.
That was me. I had my first Just For Me relaxer. I might have been 2 or 3 years old. And as I asked my mom, why was I getting a relaxer as like a toddler? She's like, we were on vacation. I wanted it to be easy. But really, I didn't know any Black women who wore their hair natural growing up. So I went to predominantly white schools. There were a few other Black girls in my classroom. We all had relaxed hair. We all had press and curls. And at my predominantly Black church, everybody was doing their Sunday best. And being their Sunday best meant your hair was pressed. When I went to Atlanta, though, Black hair capital of the world, most people were wearing weaves and most people were wearing their hair pressed. But it was the first time I realized that a relaxer wasn't the only way of doing that. And so even in my everyday life of like what it meant to be like an upwardly mobile Black woman, it meant having your hair straight, like all the way, like through me being in my early 20s.
We know that hair has been historically a critical terrain
Mm-hmm.
in which Black women have had to navigate. I mean, that's part of what you write about in Natural. But because of social media, because of Instagram, because of the way that Black folks have been able to visually capture their lives, with a certain kind of immediacy, the conversation shifted and the urgency shifted.
Mm-hmm.
Why has natural hair been such an important conversation for Black women to have in this particular moment?
Yeah. Well, I think first thing I wanted to touch on something you mentioned around like the power of social media. What that does is it gives you a lens to the people who are not in your everyday life, who you're not coming across. So really like a relatively small niche group of people who might be doing something different can have a dramatic impact on the possibilities you see for yourself. And I think just the exposure to people and to ideas that you may not feel brave enough or may not have the exposure enough to try yourself really transformed people's possibilities to see they were what they were curious about in their own beauty in their own bodies. And most of the women I spoke to who were transitioning to natural hair in that moment were doing so out of just like personal curiosity. Like, what do I look like? What does my body feel like? How does it react to things I put on it, to water, to oil, to anything? And how do I feel about that? But the point you mentioned around like, why is that meaningful? I think for most people it was really personally, intimately meaningful. But as they transitioned into doing that visibly, publicly, going to school with natural hair, going to work with natural hair, having their family see them with natural hair, that was also often what politicized them into thinking about what this meant in a broader context. So for most people, it started really personal. And it wasn't until much later, as they entered into a social context, that they started to see it in a political sense.
Why was it so important for you to not just write about Black women in the U.S., but to write about Black women across the globe as they're also confronting these issues around natural hair?
What I thought was so interesting was because of the internet, because you're being connected to people who are not necessarily sitting right next to you down the street sharing space, these natural hair spaces were incredibly global. So being in a chat room online, people were encountering folks from South Africa, from Brazil, from the UK, from France, who were all having similar conversations. And as I started to meet some of these people and see some of the threads, I realized like, wow, we're having like this big collective experience, but I became really interested in what that meant in people's everyday lives. Like, what does that mean when racial categories differ or racial histories differ in your everyday life? So that was the curiosity I had. Like, I was seeing similar discourses and threads in these shared spaces, but I intuited like this can't mean the same thing if you're in South Africa as it is in the US, and that was certainly true.
What are some of the direct challenges? Like, we know that the Crown Act exists now.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the real challenges that Black women who chose to go natural faced in the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
and also just being in public space in general?
Yeah. So the workplace, so much of our ideas around what it means to be professional, to belong in an environment where you're often the only, if not the few, means de-emphasizing the difference between yourself and the people in power. And hair is one way of doing that, either of emphasizing or de-emphasizing your culture or like who you are. And so for many of the women I spoke to, in both subtle ways and in overt ways of running up against actual policies that were governing what it means to show up professionally, um, folks are running up against that. So being like the military guidelines are an example that I put in the book of not being able to wear braids of a certain size, of dreadlocks, of cornrows. Like those were actually codified guidelines. where consequences are disciplinary for going up against those, which might mean losing economic opportunity, losing your livelihood. For many more people, it was norms, just general workplace norms, and the sorts of microaggressions and comments that you may experience that make you feel like you don't belong or are telling you and showing you don't belong. So the Crown Act has done made incredible progress in dismantling some of those like formal obstacles that Black women face. But even still, in terms of like expectations and the way that people see you, like Black women and men continue to face those obstacles every day as they enter into the workplace.
You mentioned the kind of sanctioning that could occur in the workplace, but there's also a kind of critique and sanctioning that was occurring within Black communities and Black institutions. You think about how traditional Black folks responded to the presence of afros, you know, in the late 1960s, 1970s. One, because the afro had been politicized, you know, because of political figures who had afros. But again, this kind of natural look was interpreted as being unruly and out of control. How did some of the respondents you talked to navigate issues that might have taken place within their own families or their churches and other places where folks were not necessarily affirming their right to have natural hair?
Yeah. I mean, it's so difficult because oftentimes those conversations and those conflicts are happening with like the justification of love or protection on top of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, I want you to get this job interview. And so I'm telling you, I'm telling you before somebody else is telling you that this is not like that you're like, these are the obstacles that you're going to face. And so like, coming from Spelman, for example, where we're told like, wear a black or a dark gray suit and your pearls, like it falls into that like same category in people's families of like, I'm going to tell you this with love so that I'm hurting you before other people hurt you. So that's sometimes part of it, but also there is, you know, like internalized beauty standards around like good hair being more beautiful and more manageable and prettier. Or I'm gonna like, oh, what hair kind of hair texture will your baby have if you're with this person or that person? So it isn't all. I say to say it isn't all about being protective. Although for a lot of people that was the spirit behind some of the really hurtful conversations they had with people and institutions who claim to love them. Yeah.
So I'd like to think that I am representative of most Black men in that I can't really tell the difference between whether or not it's someone's hair, a weave, a wig. Pretty just looks pretty, right? Attractive just looks attractive. How much did you place into consideration when talking to your respondents how they felt about the male gaze in terms of the choices that they made with their hair? Were they cognizant, or did they feel that they were going to be any more or any less attractive depending on whether or not their hair was natural or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of that is tied up into like both the male gaze, but also like a collective understanding of what's feminine. With straight hair showing its length more, with like short hair being associated with masculinity, or also with homosexuality as like a symbol of conveying your sexuality to others. So I think there are a few different factors coming together that were influencing how people thought about their hairstyling choices and other people's reaction to them. And part of that is about gender, and part of that is also about sexuality.
What do you think is the moment because the natural hair moment is kind of interesting in the context of how we think about racial identity and authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, respectability politics, as you mentioned, thrived on the idea of not standing out when you were in certain kinds of situations, right? Everyone else is wearing straight hair. You should straighten your hair also, right? That's 100-year-old conversation, right? Since the development of the straightening iron, for Black people, right? But there is this way that, particularly in the context of social media and some of the Black Lives Matter movements and things that have occurred in the last 15 years, that natural hair also became an emblem of authenticity. That folks who had natural hair were really, really Black, and that folks who still processed their hair or straightened their hair, weren't as authentic as they needed to be in this political moment.
Mm-hmm. Weren't as authentic, weren't as enlightened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So all of that. But it's interesting that you bring up authenticity because there's a discussion in the book around who can be natural, like who's an insider to the movement and who's an outsider to the movement and who's a stranger to the movement altogether. And so the word natural isn't racialized, at the outset. Like the definition people were using for naturalness was, is your hair unprocessed? Like, do you relax your hair or not?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
not, are you Black or not? But do you relax your hair or not? Yet at the same time, the way people thought about who natural is meaningful for, who natural is resistant for, transgressive for, important for, is Black women. And thinking about how diverse the community of Black women is in terms of not just phenotype, economic background, like where you are in the world, all of those things complicate for whom naturalness is interpreted to be meaningful and to be powerful and to be resistant for. Um, and in a world where you've got Black women with wavy hair, Black women with coily hair, Black women with silky curls, Black women who are light skinned, Black women who are dark skinned, who can be natural and have it be meaningful was and authentic. Who can be authentically natural as part of the natural hair movement was something that was constantly contested, especially in a world where women with light skin and long curly hair got more time, got more attention, got more money as
Yeah.
influencers.
Right.
So that question around like authenticity and race and also in resistance and in politics is deep and and fraught.
The other side of this, and this depends on what kind of natural hairdo you have,
Mm-hmm.
who can afford to be natural?
Who can afford to be natural?
And I raise this in the context of, what are also very clear market forces.
Mm-hmm.
25, 30 years ago, you had to have real questions to figure out where you could get your natural hair done,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where you would find supplies, right? To make sure that
Mm-hmm.
your hair remained healthy. Those questions don't come up as much anymore because literally you can walk into Walmart or Target
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
find natural hair care products, right? How do we think about this development in the context of the marketplace now?
Yeah. So it's so interesting because at that time, especially like early internet, early natural hair internet, it was how do you make up, concoct, mix together products for your hair that you can't find on the market. So there was a big like DIY ethos at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of the natural hair movement of like, let's find some flaxseed and get flaxseed gel and put coconut oil and mix it together with castor oil. And like, here are ways that we can navigate around our lack of options in the market for natural hair care. And have another way of being in your body be possible, which like then created and inspired a whole class of Black entrepreneurs who ended up bottling and marketing um, successfully, I'd say, either their knowledge in terms of like a whole class of influencers who make their money just by doing videos and not even by selling themselves as a product, and like cosmetics entrepreneurs. So there's so many interesting like interventions in the market because of the natural hair movement. And it's been interesting to me to see, like, over the arc of the last 15 years, how many of those remain in Black hands, what happens, what the sorts of reactions that consumers have when you sell a company, when you end up trying to market beyond Black women, how people feel about that. I think I talk about the Shea Moisture, A Million Ways to Shea, and what it meant when Shea Moisture, one, sold, but two, you know, started projecting themselves as a company that was for everybody and not just for Black women.
Black
And how
people,
that's interpreted, by consumers and embraced or not within the marketplace.
So, Michelle Obama never went natural. Vice President Harris didn't go natural. Who were the iconic figures and what were the cultural moments that really gave credence to the idea that there was a natural hair movement, that Black folks would have to think differently about naturals? And, more importantly for Black girls, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that the natural would be the first hair care choice for them, as opposed to having their hair pressed and curled in more traditional, historically traditional ways of taking care of their hair.
Yeah, there are a few moments that I think about. There was a really iconic O magazine cover where there's Oprah. She's got this like huge halo of natural hair. And she's sort of like, Oprah's like everybody's auntie.
Yeah, right.
She's sort of like a first super mainstream capturing of a shift in a way that like was beyond the niches of the internet and that was in your living room, and unpacking what that meant as a shift. But there are so many other figures, from like Lupita Nyong'o becoming so popular to the first models on the Victoria's Secret runway, where you start to see that like sort of mainstream femininity beginning to embrace natural hair. Which I think empowered some people who weren't looking for alternatives or who weren't exploring that, like who are now just like seeing the images that were sort of percolating through everyday life start to shift. Typically one or two, like a discrete moment in time. But I think that really started to change how folks who weren't necessarily interested in a subculture or a sub movement start to see that as a possibility for themselves.
In the political moment that we are in now, with the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, do you imagine that we go back to the cultural and professional dark ages of, say, 25, 30 years ago, and Black women's hair, how they dress, their names? Do you see what we're looking at in the future is a return to the intense policing of Black women's presence in the workforce, right? And in other social spaces?
I'm so interested to see what happens. I think we're so at the beginning of that right now. I anticipate that the protections, especially, that we're seeing will justify people being, reasonably nervous about how they show up. What I find really interesting, even before we think about sort of like external pressures, what I found really interesting in the writing of the book, which, the book comes out in 2024, natural hair movement is really starting like 10 years before that. But I felt like the book came out in a moment where we were already seeing a swing towards a different aesthetic driven by Black women themselves. So, and as I as I speak to people, to speak to Black women about what that means and how they interpret, you know, like some of the influencers that made their bread and butter on natural hair now wearing their hair straight, or talking about like all these new interesting technologies, eye tips, tape-ins, quick weaves, all these other things that people are in a moment where they're already open to and experimenting beyond thinking about naturalness as the sole way to be, and interpreting that like a sort of openness to that as the fruits of the self work, sort of like the internal work that maybe a decade of turmoil of like, do I like my body now that I know it now? And now that it's out in the world, precipitated. So I bring that up and I say all that to say that I still have some hopefulness that, as opposed to when I grew up, where it felt like there were no choices, and there wasn't acknowledgement or an awareness of the choices that we do have to style ourselves, to show up in the world, where there wasn't a sense of confidence and there wasn't necessarily like a critical self-reflective strategy about how to be yourself amidst all of the other pressures coming your way, that in a moment where I do expect there to be more policing and less protection, that women will do that, hopefully that Black women will do that from a more grounded perspective, from a more like critical, strategic, thoughtful moment of like ability to articulate what this means, that like what I'm doing outside is different than how I'm feeling inside, that I think didn't exist 15 years ago, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm hoping that like the work, like the cultural work of the natural hair movement continues to have that effect, despite what I anticipate will be a really hard near and medium term future.
We've been joined today by Chelsea Mary Elise Johnson, the author of Natural, Black Beauty and the Politics of Hair, published by New York University Press. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you again for having me.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.